Hello, welcome to my series discussing the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons from the early original edition released in 1974 through to the current 5th edition released in 2012. I'll take a look at each version to highlight the subtle and dramatic changes that have occurred since Dave Varson and Gary Gygax released the first commercially successful role-playing game on the world. So take your steps into the magical fantasy adventures made possible with D&D. Warning, here be dragons. Hello, and in today's episode we're going to continue with our original D&D coverage, and we're going to have a look at Chainmail and the supplements. Now we'll see how we do. I might split this video into two because there's quite a lot to get through, and in particular I'm going to start on Chainmail, as that was the book that was recommended that you get hold of in the original WhiteBox, and then obviously moved on to Greyhawk and the subsequent supplements that came out. Now my copy of Chainmail here is the 3rd edition, but I believe the 1st and the 2nd edition were actually published by Gideon Games in, I want to say, 1971, and they were written by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin, and they're a great set of medieval rules for miniature battles. However, where they became relevant for original D&D is that the medieval got expanded into fantasy, and from there evolved original D&D. Now, I rather dismissively said that you didn't need Chainmail. However, there is a lot to be said for having Chainmail, and in theory you can run original D&D using the Chainmail rules, which actually have, I think it's 3 or possibly 4 combat systems. So you've got the mass battles rules, you've then got the man-to-man rules, you've got the sort of fantasy monsters rules, and there's also some rules for jousting as well. So I'm not going to be claiming to be an expert on Chainmail. However, I have done a little bit of digging, including trying to work out the combat tables, because I could never quite work out what they meant, and I realised it's because I was misreading the tables. So hopefully I've managed to counterspell the befuddlement that was cast on me. And as you can see, originally it was $5. Again, signed by Gary, because this particular PDF I printed had that. It's got a pretty comprehensive table of contents, some nice little sand table pictures, and then we've got a fairly dense piece of text talking about the introduction, and let's just read you a bit of this. So, games based on warfare have interested men for centuries, as such games as checkers and chess prove. The latter games are nothing less than the warfare of the period in which they were developed, abstracted and stylized for play on a board. Chess is so abstracted that it barely is recognizable as a wargame. At the other end of the spectrum, and of much more modern invention, are military miniatures. Yeah, and it goes on a bit like that. So, to the modern ear, some of this writing might be a little bit obtuse and wordy. So we then get into the Chainmail rules for medieval miniatures, which I'm not going to spend too much time about. You've got a turn sequence, which of course is useful for D&D because it was a little bit hazy on turn sequences. Then you've got the simultaneous movement system, terrain effects, terrain selection, movement, and you'll notice troops are defined by class. So you've got armoured foot, heavy foot, your Swiss pike, your light foot archers, and they all have different moves and charge moves and missile ranges. You've got fatigue, so if you keep moving you'll get fatigued. And then you've got missile fire that's based on groups, so 1 to 2 people firing. If you're firing against unarmoured foes, on a 1 to 2 you'll cause no hits, on a 3 to 6 you'll cause 1 hit. But if you're firing, let's say, let's go here, 10 people, on a 1 to 2 you'll cause 4 hits, and on a 3 to 6 you'll cause 5 hits. And if you've got 30 people, well, you'd roll on the 17 to 20 table and the 9 to 10 table to come up to a total of 30. It talks about rates of fire, split moving, pass through fire, arcs of fire. So there's all sorts of really heavy duty stuff. There's gunpowder and siege weapons and cannons. You've got morale after a fight, and you roll some dice, and depending on the difference, people might rout. So it's, yeah, your classic sort of old school war game with miniatures, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much because we want to get into the bit that's going to interest us, which is things like man-to-man combat and the actual fantasy supplement. So man-to-man, obviously, we've got a little bit more detail that might be more useful for us as a role player. So instead of being one figure is about 20 troops, here one figure is literally one single person. So you're probably going to want to use man-to-man. And what's interesting about man-to-man combat, it actually introduces some tables where you've got armor class and weapon types. So you can see how some of the stuff that would re-emerge in AD&D, does come from Chainmail. So you can definitely see the evolution of Chainmail into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's a little bit weaker, arguing how it influenced OD&D, but I'm not saying it didn't influence it at all. That would be totally false. But I think, TSR were trying to sell both Chainmail and original D&D, so they maybe slightly enhanced the link between the two, and obviously that would inform Gary when he went on to make Advanced D&D, and he was the author of both Advanced D&D and Chainmail, so I can see why that would happen. Anyway, we've got the fantasy supplement where we've got your troops and how big or small they are. We've then got some information, so dwarves, goblins, elves, orcs, heroes, superheroes and wizards. Spells. There's a few spells in here which would obviously go on to get into D&D. So Phantasmal Force makes a lot more sense for miniature war games than it does necessarily for a dungeon. Cloud Kill, anti-magic shields, and then you've got your different levels of wizards. So a seer, then they become a magician, then they become a warlock, a sorcerer, and finally a wizard. You've got spell complexity, how easy it is to cast, and all that sort of business. Then we've got lycanthropes, trolls, so a little monster manual in here. Dragons, they get quite a lot of info even in here by Chainmail standards, quite a large amount of gumph there on them. So a bit about combat here, and it's talking about magical weapons, and they can be pretty powerful in Chainmail. For example, in mass combat, you could argue a +1 sword will give you +1d6 in your attack rolls. However, if you're doing man-to-man, maybe rather than be a +d6, it will give you a +1 on the to hit table. There's also stuff about air movement, firing your siege weapons, combination figures, and then we've got points for some of the big nasty fantasy bits, including another alignment table, which again is law, neutral and chaos. Now in the previous video I talked about how it's sort of the Moorcock Elric. You could also interpret law as being good and chaos as being evil. That's again something for your campaign. And then we get into the combat tables. Now I've actually printed them out on an A4 sheet to make them a bit easier to see and read. Now when I first looked at this table, as I said, I was a bit befuddled by it. So a light foot, attacking a light foot, doesn't get -1 die. This dash is just a stylistic bit, but unfortunately to modernise it looks like it's saying 1 die. What it's actually telling you is, in mass battles, a light foot attacking another light foot will roll 1 die per man in the unit. So if you've got a 10-man unit, you're going to roll 10d6, and the 6 kills isn't you're going to kill 6 people, but it's if you roll a 6 on that dice, you will cause a kill. So let's say you roll 10d6 and get 4 6s, well, you've killed 4 people. However, when you're attacking heavy horse, you're not as efficient. So you will roll 1d6 per 4 men. So if you've got 10 men in your unit, you're going to roll 2d6 and you need a 6 to kill. Similarly, heavy foot versus light foot, 1 dice per man with a 5+ to kill. Against heavy horse, 1 dice per 4 men with a 6 to kill. However, armoured foot, slightly better, needing a 4+ for light foot, 5+ for heavy foot, and then against heavy horse, 1 dice per 3 men. It also has a little asterisk here to say if your footmen have halberds or pikes, they get an extra d6. And there's also a little bit over on the side here talking about Swiss pike units, sort of forming a pike shield wall, for want of a better word. And they get all sorts of fancy bonuses and defend and attack as different things depending on where you attack them. Now, horse troops have a much better dice rolling pool. So Lightfoot get attacked by Light Horse. Instead of 1 die per man, they get 2 dice per man and only need a 5 to hit. And then by the time we get to Heavy Horse, when they're attacking other Heavy Horse, you get 1 die per man needing a 6. But against Lightfoot, you get 4 dice per man with a 5 getting you a kill. So a 10-man Heavy Horse unit, you're going to be rolling 40 dice versus a Lightfoot unit. And then once you've resolved all the kills, you then roll morale and people flee or hold, etc. So that's your sort of mass battles table. You've then got the man-to-man table, and here you'll see you've got weapon rank. So a dagger is much faster than a pike, but in certain combat circumstances, a pike will be superior to a dagger. Now, if I remember correctly, I think on the first round of combat, the pike would have an advantage against the dagger because of the superior reach. However, on the second round of combat, the turn order would be flipped around a bit because the dagger is now sort of underneath the pike and has a great advantage. And you've then got the armour class effectively. So 9 is no armour, 8 is leather, 7 is shield, and so on until we get down to plate armour. And then we've obviously got cavalry armour here with Bardin for your horse. And here you're going to roll 2d6 and you need to roll higher than the target. So to hit no armour with a dagger, you need to roll over a 6, whereas with a pike you need to roll over an 8. And you can see how the alternative combat system might have evolved from the man-to-man melee table. So in theory, if you're playing with Chainmail, you could probably just use d6. You don't even need the d20, and that would make more sense because, you know, polyhedral dice were something a bit new and a bit expensive and not that common. You've then got individual fire with missiles, so you've got your various ranges for your different types and a class of armour, which maps up to here, but you know they don't tell you no armour is the class. And what I'm not so sure about is here first equals no armour. So, you know, a bit vague and wishy-washy in Chainmail as to defining exactly how it works. But yeah, that is your man-to-man melee table. I'm not going to talk about jousting, but that is your jousting matrix, and you can choose to attack things and it will break lances or whatever. Yeah, I haven't really read much about that. But then the bit that's probably going to be of interest to D&D players is the fantasy reference table. So you've got your type of creature, how far it moves, its special ability that maps down to here. So hobbits have special ability A, the ability to become invisible. Now for hobbits, that's only in brush or woods, whereas for sprites, that's potentially anywhere. They've got a charge range, a fly range, a missile range, and they attack as Lightfoot if they're a hobbit, and they defend as Lightfoot. However, if we go to, let's say, orcs here, so let's see, yeah, orcs Heavyfoot. So, yeah, you can see how this table here maps to Appendix A, which is the mass battle combat tables. Down here we have lots of abilities and detect invisible creatures, F. So we have a look, who can detect invisible creatures? Heroes. Yeah, there you go. So heroes can detect invisible creatures, as can rocks and dragons, which is slightly less hobbitesque. I suppose dragons can detect them, but they can't necessarily see them though. And then there's other abilities here. So this is when they talk in OD&D about Chainmail, this potentially is the chart you want to be looking at. And then finally, we have the fantasy combat table here, where you've got who is the attacker, who is the defender, what do you need to roll over on D12. Now, dragons are pretty tricky to attack. So dragons, a dragon attacking another dragon will need an 8, but pretty much everyone else is sort of looking at 12s, apart from the superhero who's needing a 10, and then the wizard, they only need a 9. So wizards are pretty powerful on the battlefield, and it talks at the top of the table here how you need to roll. Now, if you score equal, then the defender gets pushed back. So if you roll an 8 against a dragon as a dragon, you don't hit them, but you push them back. Whereas obviously, if you just roll straight up the number, score over the total shown above, the defender is killed. No hit points, nothing, just outright dead. So if you're using this fantasy combat table in your game, I think you're being really mean to your players, because a dragon fighting a hero, which is, what is it, 4th, 5th level fighter, on a 5 or more on 2d6, they just outright kill that character. Much, much nicer, I think, to either use the combat tables for mass battles or the man-to-man melee table, although this takes into no account the skill of the individual. So a level 1 versus a level 5 person, in theory, makes very little difference to the roll on this table, apart from those, maybe the +1s you get for some hit dice. Whereas here, on the mass combat tables, your hit dice is how many d6 you roll. So if you're a level 5 character with 5 hit dice, you're going to roll 5d6 on this table. And if you're wearing, for example, chainmail, you might be counted as heavy foot. So fighting against someone in leather armour, you're going to roll 5 dice, so you're equivalent to 5 fighters. And on any 5 or more results on your dice, you're going to get a hit. And I can see how taking this combat table into D&D makes a lot of sense. I think this table evolves into the advanced combat table or alternative combat table that we're used to on D&D. And so if you're going to use this table, maybe you might as well just use the alternative combat. But using the fantasy sheet, I think it's a bit too deadly. Now, where it might work is if you use the attack table for the hero versus a dragon, but when the dragon attacks back, you use a different table. But then you got all sorts of complexity if you're doing that. Of course, if you're using hit points, you could always say a kill is 1 hit point rather than an outright kill. So it depends, do you want your combat to be fast and lethal, or do you want it to be a bit drawn out? So anyway, there you go. That was my quick look at Chainmail. So having dismissed it in the first video, obviously it is worth a look at, and I think there's some interesting ideas, but really, rather than get the entire booklet, what you need are these tables. Although good luck deciphering the jousting matrix, I need to go off and read the rules and decide if I want to bother with them. So there you go. So that is pretty much original D&D 1974 covered. I think it's a great rule set, as I've said. It's fairly lightweight on rules. I would say 90% of what makes D&D great is in the rulebook, and for $10 you can't go far wrong. And as I said in my previous video, at the time of publishing that one, I think you can pick it up for $5-6, so absolute bargain. But they didn't stay still. D&D was so popular, they moved on and started producing supplements, and rather than go with Blackmoor, the first fantasy campaign, they decided to go with Gary Gygax's own setting, Greyhawk. So let's have a look at that. Now, Greyhawk was the first supplement actually issued by TSR, and we get to see the Beholder. Now, one of the big problems is if you're used to more modern versions of Greyhawk, you'll see this and think, this is the first Greyhawk supplement. It's going to tell me all about Greyhawk. Well, not really. It's more a set of rules and expansion of the original 1974 rules, and it takes D&D into a sort of near first edition AD&D territory, and it's a really good set of rules, and it definitely enhances the game. Now this is a reprint from 2003, I think, of the original 1976 version. So it looks a little bit better, I think, than it probably did originally. And it talks to you here about how this is stuff that was used in the Greyhawk campaign. So this is effectively Gary Gygax's house rule variants for D&D. Now, famously, it includes a dexterity-based character, the Thief. And I believe there's multiple versions of the Thieves for original D&D, but this is the one that got actually published and is the one we sort of know and love. Now, I do know some original players weren't so keen on the introduction of the Thief, as it brought in sort of a skill system which D&D sort of has, in the idea of like listening at doors and spotting hidden secret doors and bits and pieces like that. But it actually brought in like things like percentage dice and all the open locks and climb and move silently and all that stuff. Now, I quite liked it. I used to love playing a thief, but I can sort of see how it sort of broke up the game. It also introduced the Paladin as well. It's got a load of extra information about the various races and, expanding the alignment table. It introduces us to the carrion crawler here, I see. And then we've got our abilities, and you'll notice these are much more expanded, and you've got 18 strength now giving you +2 to hit, +3 to damage, +500 weight, the ability to smash open doors on any roll but a 6 on a d6, and then you get exceptional strength if you roll an 18. And I'm not so sure. I mean, having discovered it via AD&D, I don't have such a big problem with it, but coming from original D&D, it is a little bit of a shocking thing. Now, fighters, I believe, are the only ones who are allowed to have exceptional strength. Intelligence, we've got a chance to know spells, the minimum spells per level, the maximum spells per level, and enhanced spells. So if you've got an intelligence of 17, you can learn 9th level spells. But if you've only got 11, well, you're limited to 6th level spells. Thieves use dexterity, wisdom, charisma, and all that good stuff. So bonuses to the advancement of ability. So constitution now is a little bit more detailed about what that means for resurrection and surviving, rather than, oh, you're a bit better at doing it. Non-player characters, so we've tweaked the loyalty and stuff there. We've got details about the thief here. Statistics regarding classes, so we now have a tweaked hit point. Instead of everyone being on a d6, this is where we get the d4, the d6, the d8 introduced. So fighters have the most hit points with d8, thieves and magic users have d4, leaving the cleric with good old-fashioned d6. We've got expanded spell tables for our magic users and clerics there. Lots of stuff about thieves' ability here, so open locks and remove traps. At first level, pretty low, 10 to 15%. And once you get up to level 12, a thief will always be able to open locks and pretty much always guarantee removing traps. Now, the problem here is, in the past, you have to role play solving traps. Now, there's the temptation just to roll a percentage dice and, yeah, you've solved it, moving on. So I can see why some people used to the original version weren't so keen on it. We've got some guidance on XP here to clarify how much XP you should be getting, and this is potentially where the Monty Hall campaign's really kicked off, because it's a bit easier to kill things and get XP, and maybe gold is becoming less important and monsters more so. Non-player characters, there's a change to the rules suggested here. The alternative combat system is now pretty much the default, and as it says here, the matrix has been drawn from the hand-to-hand combat section of Chainmail. So, your daggers versus armor class matter now, and there's all sorts of complex maths there. We've then got different damage, so daggers will do 1 to 4 points of damage versus man-sized foes, but only 1 to 3 against larger foes. So this is where variable weapon damage comes in, and as you can see here, instantly OD&D's been transported from a D6 base game into one much more like first edition D&D. We've also got negative armor classes, flank attacks, attacks and damage by monster type. So a goblin will have one attack doing 1 to 4 damage rather than the 1d6 damage. And there's a whole load of sort of monster manually bits there. Dragons, 2 claws and a bite attack, and lots of damage potentially. Then the spell tables, and you'll notice something interesting here. There are now extra spells. Let's see if I can get this moved so you can see it a bit better. Let's try refocus. Tell you what, let's move the camera. There you go. So, shield, magic missile, ventriloquism with an asterisk. They are new spells, and that gives magic users now a combat ability at first level, which I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not. I mean, coming from AD&D and basic, it made sense to me back in the day, but nowadays not so much. And also we go all the way up to 9th level. So we've got explanations of all the spells, so I'm not going to bore you to death by going through all of them. But yeah, I mean, some of them, like Raise Dead Fully. This spell is simply a Raise Dead spell, which also restores full strength to the person so raised, and no rest or recuperation is required thereafter. The reverse of this spell disallows a saving throw, automatically killing its target unless the object is protected by a device to counter such spells. Nasty. So monsters and treasures, we got some expanded bit on monsters, possibly some new ones I can't remember without going through it all. Some more info on dragons there, as if we haven't got enough info on dragons. Then we got treasure, and there's a huge amount of extra magic items and artefacts in here. So swords get another mention, armor, potions, winds, wands, miscellaneous magic. Just loads and loads of stuff in here. Where's the artefacts? Are we into the artefacts? I'm pretty sure there's things like the Hand of Vecna and stuff like that all comes in here. The Book of Vile Darkness is getting a mention. Yeah, we got the Deck of Many Things showing up. We then get a load of information of the Underworld and Wilderness adventures with some extra info. Monstrous tricks and combination monsters, so you could make thieves with bugbear guards, for example. Haha, won't that really be nasty? Talking of bugbears, very RuneQuest this artwork. Apparently that was a mistaken communication. A bugbear is not meant to have a pumpkin head. And then we got some corrections, the good old owlbear, and then right at the back a little kind of catalogue, I guess. So as you can see, I've just whistled through Greyhawk there, but there's a lot in here, and it's quite a big old tome for an expansion. What is it, 67 pages of extras and clarifications to the original rules. Now this makes the game much more complex. As I say, I think it starts a little bit of the sort of Monty Hall Munchkin elements of D&D, but it's still close enough to original D&D and first edition that I don't have a massive problem with it. And there are lots of great things in here to take out. Now the spells I think you could take out of here. Whether you'd want to keep them at the same levels, well, that's a different story. Like, you know, do you really need Magic Missile at first level for a magic user? Maybe not, maybe make it second level. But obviously with magic users becoming much weaker and daggers only doing 1d4 damage, I guess to offset that, the magic missile was to set up your sort of damage dealing, ranged attack magic user. And of course it allows for the D&D cartoon to have the guy with his weird, almost like magic missile bow to exist. And yeah, I do recommend the cartoon. It was quite a good kid show for D&D, although it came out, I believe, after first edition, but I wouldn't quote you on that. So there you go, great artwork, great set of text, and lots to enjoy in Greyhawk, but not much actual campaign information beyond maybe if you read about liches and harpies, maybe you might glean some information about the setting from the descriptions. And if you flip to a spell like there's a bag of transmuting, well, you know, maybe that's unique to Greyhawk. So as a Greyhawk supplement, it's not very good for Greyhawk, but it's great for the game. And you'd have to wait for the Greyhawk box set to come out, and I think there might have been a little pamphlet before that, if I remember, to actually tell you about the Greyhawk setting beyond just the stuff you could read in magazine articles and letters and stuff. So yeah, it's a very interesting expansion and slightly different to Blackmoor, which will be the next booklet I'm going to look at. Now, Blackmoor was, interestingly, the first fantasy campaign, but it's supplement too for D&D, and maybe this is the start of the tension between Gary and Dave, and it is credited to Dave, but I've read somewhere that Dave didn't have much to do with it, and in fact Mr. Tim Kask was the main person involved in getting this set up. So we've got an index, and we've got Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasures, and the Underworld mentioned there. Then in the introduction, caution, this is the second supplement to the highly addictive game D&D. Handle it at your own risk. Even a brief perusal can infect the reader with the desire to do heroic deeds, cast mighty magical spells, and seek to wrest treasure from hideous monsters. Well, rather dramatic. 1975, Gary Gygax, and when he's in full flow, he's a good read. Anyway, this is Gary being quite nice to Dave, and I have seen some archaeologists of the game, and I believe it might even be referred to in the Secrets of Blackmoor, how things started going a bit wrong, and later documentation is not so nice towards Dave. Anyway, got more stuff about clerics and a new class, monks, which I'm not a fan of. They're a sort of a weird oriental character rather than your sort of Sean Connery style investigative monk. And if you get them up to maximum level, they're absolutely obscene in this set here. So at 10th level, that they have 18th intelligence in regard to telepathy. At 13th level, they gain quivering palm, usable once a week, which basically just kills people. So yeah, a little bit obscene. Then we've got some more information about thieves and developing them into a specialist sort of thief called an assassin. So they've got disguise and assassinate, and I used to love playing assassins in first edition AD&D, but yeah, yet more funkiness there. And then we got our statistics. So we've got the monks who, once they get to level 5, 6, something like that, they then have this weird Grand Master system, which is sort of to try and limit monks getting too high a level. And the assassin has a D6, so they're a thief with a D6 who's not so good at thief skills, but they've got this assassination. So at level 1, you have a 75% chance of killing a hit dice 1 critter. That's pretty devastating. We've got hit locations. So yeah, that's a bit weird, and that's very sort of RuneQuest-esque, I guess. Yeah, so all sorts of different creature types with hit locations in there. Then we got this weapon and height adjustment matrix, so that's all very funky. Weapon lengths and how they might impact combat. Now, I'm not sure how much of this is actually genuinely from the notes of Dave and how much is Gary, but yeah, it's shows you a slightly different approach to playing the game with things like hit location and psionics. So we've got attacks by monster types here. So we've got seahorses, and they've got 1 butt attack causing a 1d6 damage, whereas a giant beetle, if it's a stag beetle, 3 to 12 mouth attack and 1 to 10 for a horn. Obviously monsters and treasures to go with it. Nice hellhounds there, very much like a warg to me. Umber Hulk, great creatures, love them. The Shantal, I think, up there in the top right corner. Oh, Shalgun, there we go, Devil Men. So very sort of Deep One-esque. Floating Eyes, yeah, we all know what those are. A bit of beholder action. So we've also got the Ithiliads, or Mind Flayers as they were called back then. And then we get to the main feature of this book, which, unlike Greyhawk, does actually give you a hint of the setting. We've got the Temple of the Frog. And there's a whole load of stuff in here, which is a good insight into how maybe people thought. And again, if you go to the Secrets of Blackmoor video, you will actually get to meet the High Priest of the Temple of the Frog. It was actually a player eventually. And yeah, some really cool stuff in here, with some maps and everything. And this figure, I'm sure, gets reused in AD&D. But there you go. And look at this map here. It's just crazy. It's showing you sort of how the mega dungeon might be laid out. And then we get randomly into underwater adventures. So, having spells to be able to breathe underwater starts becoming important, and shows you how D&D is moving out of the dungeon and into overland, in the air, and stuff like that. And then some really nasty disease rules. If your player's life's not miserable enough, you can give them bubonic plague and leprosy and spotted fever and yeah, all sorts of horrible stuff there. And then a nice picture of a chimera, and then some notes. So very, very different supplement. Kind of, we've pretty much got almost all the characters in the game now. There are a few more, I think, in Eldritch Wizardry. I find out when we open up the book. But this is much more of a settings book, and as I say, because it was more created by the editor rather than the actual supposed author. So yeah, very interesting, and it's nice to see at this stage Gary and Dave are obviously still on speaking terms, but that's, as D&D evolves, is going to start becoming a problem because when was this, 1975? Yeah, in about 2 years' time, Gary Gygax is going to start writing and publishing advanced D&D, and that is going to lead to some bad blood between him and Dave Arneson. Anyway, that was an even quicker look at Blackmoor Supplement 2. Let's have a look at Supplement 3. Now, Supplement 3 has a fancy colour cover, and yeah, it's going to cause a bit of controversy, and I guess we're starting to get into the start of the bothered about Dungeons and Dragons movement, because this is all about Eldritch Wizardry and summoning demons and making your child become a satanic devil worshipper. So here you go. The book you now hold in your hand represents new dimensions to an already fascinating game system. This is the third supplement to D&D and was produced as a result of an ever-increasing demand for new material, a new trend in the fine art of dungeon mastering. As originally conceived, D&D was limited in scope only by imagination and devotion of dungeon masters everywhere. So notice dungeon masters is now a thing. They were referees in original D&D, so we're moving closer and closer to what will become a D&D. And in here we've got some more info about your fighters, your magic users, your clerks. Druids. Okay, so Druids are now in the game, and I think, have we got Rangers somewhere? So monks and Druids do not have psychic potential. They are therefore prohibited from becoming psychic. So psionics is definitely a thing in here. And we've now got how to get your experience points for your Druids. Then we've got more alternative combat system stuff going on, so adjusting missile and spell casting based on what's going on with your dexterity and when you're going, and it's all quite complex, to be honest. Psionic combat and attacks and defenses, matrix for attacks on non-psionics. Yeah, all sorts of stuff on psionics there. Yet more spell lists, this time mostly for Druids. Psionics stuff again. So magic user, some new spells there. Some cleric spells. Artwork of some demons, because that's going to be a feature coming up in here. So we've got type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, succubi, type 5 and type 6 demons, and then the big bad boys, Orcus and Demigods, and then some other bits and some more info on mind flayers. So I can't remember if it was just artwork in Blackmoor, but got statted up in here. And yeah, we've got some very interesting artwork going on, including some naughty ladies with no clothes on and demon amulets. Yeah, then treasures. So there's some very interesting. Yes, this is where we get the Hand of Vecna. Yeah, okay, so it's this book that gives us demons and artefacts. Yeah, so this rounds out nicely our collection of bits and pieces, and then some more random encounters. So this supplement, I'm not so keen on some of the rules it introduced, but I like the demons with the type 1, type 2, and I guess that was created to get round some of the issues with like Balrogs and stuff like that. because Tolkien had come after TSR for some IP infringement. And I've got a feeling this Type 1 demon got involved in a court case with Games Workshop over Demon of Change, I want to say. And this artwork was enough to deal with that court case. And that was very interesting development there. Anyway, that just leaves what is, in my opinion, the worst supplement of all for original D&D: Gods, Demigods and Heroes. Now, Gods, Demigods and Heroes is basically just a list of random gods, and yeah, I'm not so keen on this, to be honest. So, well, here it is, the last D&D supplement. This is with a strange mixture of sadness and relief that I tell you this. My first assignment fresh out of college was Blackmoor. I came to regard it with a mixture of love and loathing that has gradually seen the love win out. The loathing grew out of the educational trip that it was for me. Anyway, here we go. We're going to have to do the same for D&D everywhere. We told you just about everything we can. From now on, when circumstances aren't covered somewhere, wing it. And then, here, there's, does it talk about Monty Hall? I'm sure it does. And here you go. Perhaps now some of the giveaway campaigns will look foolish as they truly are. This is our last attempt to delineate the absurdity of 40 level characters. When Odin the Allfather has only a mere 300 hit points, who can take a 44th level lord seriously? 1976. Now, this is the last Dungeons and Dragons supplement, because at this point, Gary Gygax has been furiously beavering away to bring out advanced D&D. And if I remember correctly, it was 1977 where the Monster Manual was published, which is basically an original D&D monster manual. Just had some of the serial numbers filed off and, advanced D&D slapped on the cover. But what we then get, and I'm going to spend probably hardly any time on this, is just a list of god after god after god after god, and yeah, it's not that good. Although some of the monsters of mythology are a bit more useful. We've also got some funky stuff in the back here for some maybe slightly more obscure monsters and mythic characters and gods. And yeah, Odin's got a load of stuff in there. But if you look at it, let's just pick out Ptah, god of outer space, opener of the ways. So this is one of the Egyptian gods. They have an armor class of 5. They move ? They have 200 hit points. They have magic ability as below, fighter ability of 18th level, and psionic ability of 6. Ptah is said to have existed before the gods. He stands 10 feet tall with a humanoid shape, jet black skin, and eyes that seemingly appear invisible, but upon close inspection are really pools of outer space. He can force beings into nameless void with the look of his eyes, make a magic saving throw basically, sending one being per melee round into this void. Only he can bring them out again. So, the gods are pretty nasty, and I guess with 200 hit points, that's pretty impressive. But if you're an 18th level fighter, rolling d6 per level, that's not many hit points versus 200. But if you're a 40th level character, then 40 times 6 is, potentially more hit points. So, yeah. Not much really to say about this. It's an interesting read, some nice ideas. I do like the future sort of concept that these gods are not the actual gods, but are in fact like avatars. That's a much better idea, and they should have proposed that in here. Now the problem is, by statting up all these gods, obviously players had the idea, let's travel to the outer planes, let's go and find Don, god of the dead, the Dark One, and let's kill him, because, that's going to be awesome, isn't it? So yeah, I really not a big fan of gods, demigods and heroes. I did quite like deities and demigods just for some ideas for clerics, but what would have been better in here is if, rather than just list the gods, it actually gave you some variations for your clerics, so different spells, different weapons, different armour. So yeah, there's good bits in here, and I wouldn't say it's a totally pointless supplement, but it's the worst one in my opinion. Anyway, that is pretty much it for the original D&D saga. There is a slight twist in the tale though, because there is Holmes Basic, which I'm going to talk about together with the BX sets, and possibly chucking a bit of Beckme as well, because the final hurrah really for original D&D was the Holmes basic set, which was tweaked to be sold as a basic cheap introduction to D&D that would then lead you into advanced D&D. But Holmes basic is really original D&D, just clarified. But yeah, it did evolve slightly in the process. So you've got Supplement 4, Supplement 3, Supplement 2, and the one that most people rave about, Supplement 1. And combining that with original WhiteBox, you pretty much have advanced D&D. And if I was only going to buy one supplement, it probably would be Greyhawk, but then you're going to miss out on the interesting adventuring ideas that is Blackmoor. Anyway, there you go. That's that, and I think we'll see you in the next episode. So hopefully you've enjoyed that little whistle-stop tour of the supplements and then a slightly more detailed look at Chainmail. So until the next one, happy gaming.